Hello and welcome to the Echoes and Curves Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. I'm Angela Walters from Quilting is My Therapy. In this challenge, we're going to take the serpentine lines outside the blocks and put them in the backgrounds of our quilts. We're going to create an all-over serpentine line design that will add a beautiful texture to bigger backgrounds or even as an all-over design for your quilt. I'm going to show you how to quilt it, give you some ideas on how to switch it up, then we'll learn how to use it to highlight certain areas of our quilts. This design works within a defined area, so you need to have two boundaries that you're going to be filling in. Now on this quilt sandwich, I've just marked out a couple of lines to treat as my edges. So starting from one of my boundaries, I'm going to quilt a wavy line to the other side. Once I get to the other edge, I'm going to travel along the seam until I'm a couple inches away. Then I'm going to quilt another wavy line towards the other side. The spacing between these wavy lines doesn't really matter. You're not really going to see them once the whole area is filled in. I quilt mine about 2 inches apart just because that's an easy width for me to fill in. Now I have two boundaries that I'm going to fill in with my serpentine line. So starting from that edge, I'm going to quilt my first serpentine line up to the other side. If there happens to be a gap after I quilt my first line, I'm going to add another little echo line to fill it in and then continue quilting my serpentine lines. In past videos of this challenge, we've already worked on filling in irregular areas with our serpentine lines. The main difference here is that now our irregular area consists of wavy lines, not necessarily straight edges. But everything that we talked about is still the same. I still want one side higher than the other, I'm still trying to keep my spacing consistent, and I'm still trying to fill in the area as much as possible. So I'm going to keep quilting those serpentine lines until I get all the way to the other side. As you approach the edge of the area, you're going to notice that you'll be left with another little gap over here. I'm just going to keep echoing the line and filling in that space. Then I'm going to make my way out to the edge so I can do it again. So here's the first section of our design. Now we're going to keep doing that until we fill in the area. I'm going to travel along that edge about 2 inches or so and repeat quilting another wavy line to the opposite side. Alright, so now I have my second section and I'm going to quilt more serpentine lines in this one. I like to quilt my next section with the serpentine lines going in the opposite direction. This first section, the left side is higher and the right side is lower. So on this one, I'm going to quilt the left side lower and the right side higher. And then I'm going to start filling in the area with those serpentine lines. One thing I want to point out is that as I'm traveling along this line, I'm getting a little bit more thread buildup, a little bit more dense quilting right here, and that's okay. I think that's what makes this design look awesome. You get a little bit more dense quilting here, a little bit less in the center. I think it really gives it a look of depth, a little bit of look of roundness. So don't stress out too much. If your lines are starting to build up in the center, it's going to look great. As the wavy lines curve away from you, you'll have to travel a little bit longer to get to that seam. And as they curve in, you won't have to quilt quite as far to run into them. And the great thing about this design is that if an individual line doesn't look quite right, it doesn't matter. When you're done, all you're going to see is that beautiful texture. And there we have the second section filled in. And basically, that's how we're going to quilt this design. We're going to keep making our section and filling them in with more wavy lines. Now before we start quilting on the challenge quilt, let me show you a couple tricks that might make it a little bit easier. If you want a design that's a little bit more orderly, you can use a wavy ruler to create those sections and then fill them in. Here's the thing though, if the line is really curvy, it can be a little bit trickier to fill in. So look for something with a nice gentle wave. If you don't like quilting with rulers, you could just mark out the wavy lines and then quilt them. And remember, those wavy lines don't have to echo, so even if you're using a ruler, it doesn't have to have those perfect echo lines. So now that I have my section, I can go ahead and fill those in with serpentine lines. And even though I have two different waves over here, I can still fill in that area as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that real quick so we can see what it looks like. If you want to give the design a slightly different look, you could echo your wavy lines before you fill them in. What that's going to do is create a little bit of space in between the sections. It's going to give it a little bit of a different look, but one of the benefits is that it results in less thread buildup on those wavy lines. So if you're struggling with hitting that line perfectly, this might be a great option. Try to keep the spacing of your echo line about the same as your serpentine lines. That way you still have a nice all-over textured look. You could even experiment with adding more echo lines in between your sections. This is especially helpful if you're not loving the serpentine lines and don't want to quilt quite as many. Once you get to the edge of your defined area, you're not going to have room for any more wavy lines. Well, all you're going to do is quilt serpentine lines in between the straight and the wavy lines to fill in the rest of the space. On a side note, when I'm filling in the edge of a quilt like this, I like to leave a little bit of batting and backing on the side. That way I have something to grab onto. But if I don't have enough to hold onto, what I could do is just rotate the quilt so that now I can hold on both sides. I mean, if you think about it, you really only have control of the quilt if your hands can be on it. One last option before we start quilting the quilt. If you don't like the serpentine lines, or you're struggling with them, or you just want to do something different, you can replace them with any design. But if you still want that beautiful curvy look, try replacing them with arcs. Can you see one of my bad habits? One of my worst habits is that I don't move my hands often enough when I'm quilting on the sewing machine. You have your best control when your hands are on both sides of the needle. So that's definitely one habit I need to get better at. Now that we know how to quilt the design, let's put it on our challenge panel. Now, if you're quilting along with me on the challenge panel, we're going to be using this design to fill in the lighter area of our quilt. But what I'm going to do is use it to highlight certain portions of the quilt that I want to show off. First, I need to look at the quilt top. I'm going to pick an area or two to highlight. I'll echo inside of them, and then I'll fill in the rest of the area with those wavy lines. I could quilt them horizontally, or I could quilt them vertically. But I think what I'm going to do is quilt them on an angle so they kind of follow the general flow of the blocks. To really help this block stand out, I need to make sure it's quilted differently than the background filler. Now I'm using echo lines because that's what we're learning in this challenge, but it could really be any design as long as it's different looking than the serpentine lines. I'm quilting these blocks first because now they're going to act as part of my boundary that I'll be filling in with that all over serpentine line. I can highlight as many of these blocks as I want, but I have to remember that the more blocks I have, the more boundaries I'm going to have to be working around. So if you're a little bit newer to quilting, just start with one or two, or if you're up for a challenge, quilt several of them. Once I'm ready to start filling it in, I'm going to take a second and think about where I'm going to place my design. I want it to kind of follow the curve of the pattern, so my serpentine lines, for the most part, are going to go on the diagonal. So since I want the design to fall in this area, I'm going to be filling in these two boundaries with the design. If you don't like the thought of just winging it, you can mark out your lines or give yourself some kind of guideline. I like quilting this design as I go. I like to quilt my two wavy lines and then fill it in, kind of working through the area chunk by chunk. However, you could definitely do it different. If you wanted to, you can quilt all your wavy lines first, kind of get the sandwich stabilized, and then come back and fill them in with serpentine lines. Okay, once my area is filled in, it's time to do another. And if this were a quilt I were working on at home, I would continue filling in this area. But I kind of want to show you what it's going to look like when we go behind the block. Now our next boundary would be between these two. What that's going to do is it's going to kind of make the design look like it's going behind this block, really help push this block up to the forefront while creating a beautiful texture in the background. Now I'm sure it goes without saying that I'm using this dark thread so that you can really see the quilting. When working on your quilts, definitely use a thread color that blends in. The whole point of this design is to have that beautiful texture, not to stand out. If you're quilting along with me on the challenge panel, use the bone colored thread for this section. What I love about the design, it becomes so nice and repetitive, and it's almost meditative. Well, once you get the hang of it, that is. Now that I have a plan, all I have to do is keep filling in the area with those wavy lines and those serpentines. Now that we've seen how to quilt this design on a sewing machine, let's talk about quilting it on the long arm. Quilting this design on a long arm really isn't that much different. Now, applying it to a quilt on a long arm is completely different. Those of you that are long armers know that quilting horizontally is no problem, but quilting vertically can be. While it's not impossible, it's definitely not fun. Since I can only access so much of my quilt at one time, I'd have to advance the quilt back and forth just to quilt those wavy lines. So on a long arm, I'm going to quilt this either horizontally or diagonally. And again, just like on a sewing machine, don't worry too much about the wavy lines being perfectly wavy or that they're exactly where they need to be. Just focus on filling in the whole area as much as possible. Now, working your way around those blocks that you're highlighting can get a little tricky sometimes. For instance, when quilting out this line for my next section, you're going to notice I don't have another one over here. I can't really put a serpentine line in the boundaries if there's no boundary. So what I'm going to do is travel, work my way back up to the block, and then continue on. I don't have to quilt the whole row right now. I can come back and get the bottom half later on. Okay, now it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on the custom panel designed for this challenge, go ahead and fill in the areas highlighted in red with the Allover serpentine design. Don't forget, I have the quilting diagrams that you can download. It has tips and up-close pictures of the quilting. Well, thanks so much for quilting along with me. Next week, we're gonna see how to quilt the same Allover design, but with some more straight lines. If you like the video or the challenge, please give it a thumbs up. That helps other quilters find it as well. Happy quilting!